$20 for the whole lot. That's what the sign said, hand-lettered on a piece of cardboard taped to a folding table outside a house on Rideau Crescent in Kemptville, Ontario, on a Saturday in late September when the maples had already gone orange and the morning smelled like wood smoke and coming cold. Ray Dufresne almost didn't stop. He was on his way back from the hardware store, half a tank of gas. Nothing particular on his mind except whether the weather would hold long enough for him to finish re-shingling the back of the garage. He saw the sign from the road, he saw the table, he saw the cardboard boxes lined up along the driveway, the way they were at every estate sale, the life of a person, spread out on folding tables in the grey morning light, waiting for strangers to pick through it. He stopped. He wasn't sure why. Ray Dufresne was not a collector. He was not a man who went to estate sales looking for treasure. He was 54 years old, a recently retired school principal from Perth, divorced, living alone in a house that was already too big for him, and the last thing he needed was more stuff. He told himself he'd take one look and keep moving. He parked the truck on the shoulder and walked over. A woman in her 40s was managing the table. A daughter, maybe, or a niece, with the particular exhausted look of someone who had spent the last 3 days going through a dead person's belongings and trying to attach prices to things she didn't know how to value. She nodded at Ray when he came over. She didn't say anything. There was a coffee thermos on the table beside her, and she was working on it steadily. Most of what was out there was the ordinary residue of a long life. Dishes, a box of paperback novels, a lamp with a yellowed shade, tools in a plastic milk crate, a hammer, some chisels, a hand plane with a cracked tote. Ray picked up the hand plane, looked at it, set it back down. Then he saw the chest. It was sitting on the ground at the end of the table, not on display so much as pushed to the side, like something that had been dragged out of a basement and set down without much thought about whether anyone would want it. Military green, dented along one side, the kind of trunk that had been made to survive things that folding tables and cardboard boxes could not. There was a sticker on the lid, half peeled off, and beneath it Ray could see the faint stencil of a name and a number, the lettering worn almost to nothing by whatever decades had passed over it. He crouched down. "What's in it?" he said. The woman looked over. "Honestly, I don't know. It was locked when we found it. We got it open with a screwdriver. There's some old papers in there and some other things. Nothing valuable. You can look." Ray opened the lid. Inside, folded in a piece of canvas that had gone brown at the edges, there was a dress uniform jacket, Royal Canadian Navy. The buttons still had their shine somehow after all those years. Beside it, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white, was something Ray didn't immediately recognize. A long, flat case, dark wood, the kind of thing that might hold a fountain pen if the pen were 3 feet long. He lifted it out. He set it across his knees and unlatched the 2 small clasps and opened it. He looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. "What is it?" the woman said. "I'm not sure," Ray said, which was not entirely true. He'd had some idea. He just wanted to be careful about saying it out loud until he was certain. $20 for the whole trunk, the woman said, like the sign says. Ray looked at the jacket. He looked at the case. He looked at the stenciled name on the inside of the lid, which he could just barely make out now that he was closer. PC. He closed the lid of the case. He stood up. "I'll take it," he said. He drove home with the trunk in the bed of the truck, and the feeling you get sometimes when you've done something that can't be undone. Not regret exactly, more like the awareness that a thing has started and you don't yet know where it ends. In the garage, he set the trunk on his workbench and went through it properly, with the overhead light on and a cup of tea going cold beside him. The dress uniform was navy, as he'd thought. The rank insignia on the sleeve was that of a lieutenant commander. There were 4 service ribbons on the breast. Ray photographed them with his phone and spent 20 minutes that evening identifying them. The Canadian Volunteer Service Medal, the 1939 45 Star, the Atlantic Star, and one he almost missed, tucked in at the end, that stopped him cold when he finally got a clear image of it. The mention in Despatches, a small bronze oak leaf on a ribbon the colour of muted red and grey, given for acts of gallantry or distinguished service that did not warrant a higher decoration, but that someone, somewhere, had thought deserved to be written down and remembered. Ray sat with that for a while. In the trunk, under the jacket, there was a folded piece of paper, a letter handwritten in an angular, careful hand. It was addressed to no one. It began without a salutation. It said, "I am setting this down because my daughter asked me once where I was during the war, and I told her I was on a boat. which is true enough, and I have never said more than that. She didn't push. She is a good woman, and she has never pushed. But she will go through my things eventually, and I want her to have something more than a chest full of things she can't explain." That was as far as Ray got before he had to stop and set the letter down on the workbench and look at the wall for a while. The name stenciled on the trunk was a Ubri, PC. The letter was signed at the bottom in the same careful hand, Petty Chester Aubrey, HMCS Sackville, 1942 to 1944. Ray picked up his phone. The internet, it turns out, knows quite a lot about HMCS Sackville. If you're from Nova Scotia, you probably already know. If you're not, you may not. And Ray Dufresne was from Perth, Ontario, and had grown up knowing the war at the distance most Canadians of his generation knew it. Through his grandfather's silence, through cenotaph services on November 11th, through a school textbook that gave the Battle of the Atlantic 4 paragraphs and moved on. HMCS Sackville was a Flower-class corvette. She was commissioned in December 1941. She was one of the ships that ran the North Atlantic convoy routes, the most brutal posting of the Canadian War. Some historians would later say more brutal in some ways than the beaches of Normandy, because it went on for years, because the cold and the water did not distinguish between friend and enemy, and because the men who served on those ships lived in a state of sustained dread that left marks that didn't show up on X-rays. The convoy routes ran from Halifax and Sydney across to Britain. The corvettes escorted the merchant ships, the ones carrying food and fuel and ammunition, the ones the U-boats were trying to sink. The U-boats would come at night, or in fog, or both. Sometimes the men on the corvettes would hear the explosion before they saw anything, a sound like a door slamming somewhere far away, and then the sky would open up orange. Ray read about this for 2 hours. He read about the losses. He read about the cold. He read about what it was like to haul a man out of the North Atlantic in January when the water temperature was 2 degrees Celsius, and the man had been in it for 20 minutes. Then he went back to the letter. Petty Chester Aubrey had not written about the cold. He had not written about the explosions. He had written in his careful angular hand about a night in the autumn of 1943 in the North Atlantic, somewhere east of the Newfoundland coast, when the convoy he was part of came under attack and a merchant ship 4 positions ahead of them went down in under 4 minutes. There was a man in the water, Aubrey had written. He was alive when we spotted him. He was not a big man. I went in after him. This is not as heroic as it sounds. I want to be clear about that. I went in after him because it was the thing to do, and I had a line tied around me, and the water was very cold, and I was not in it for long. He lived. I have thought about him many times over the years. I never knew his name. He was a merchant sailor, and his ship went down, and I helped pull him out of the water, and that was the end of our acquaintance. I got a piece of paper for it that said I had done something worthy of mention. I put it in a box, and I did not mention it. Ray set the letter down. He did not sleep well that night. The woman from the estate sale was named Cynthia Berard. Ray found her through the obituary. Petty Chester Aubrey had died in June at 91 after a short illness, and the obituary in the local paper ran 2 paragraphs and mentioned that he was predeceased by his wife Margaret and was survived by his daughter Cynthia and 2 grandchildren. It did not mention HMCS Sackville. It did not mention the mention in Despatches. It did not mention the man in the water. Ray drove back to Kemptville the following Saturday. The estate sale was long over. The house on Rideau Crescent was quiet, a sold sticker on the realty sign out front. He knocked anyway on the off chance and was surprised when the door opened. Cynthia Berard was still there. She was packing the last of the kitchen things into boxes, getting ready to hand over the keys. She looked at Ray for a moment without placing him. "I bought the trunk," he said, 3 weeks ago. The green military trunk. Her expression shifted into something he couldn't quite read. "Right," she said. "Come in." She made him tea in a kitchen that was mostly empty, the cupboard doors open, the counters bare. Ray set the letter on the table between them. He had left the trunk at home. He had thought it might be too much all at once. Cynthia read the letter slowly. She read it twice. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. "He never said anything," she said. "He never said a single word about any of it. Did you know he was on the corvettes?" "I knew he was on a boat," she said, which was almost exactly what Chester Aubrey had written. "I told her I was on a boat, which is true enough. He used to say that whenever someone asked. He was on a boat. And then he'd change the subject, and that would be the end of it." Ray thought about the 4 ribbons on the dress uniform. He thought about the small bronze oak leaf. He earned a mention in Despatches, Ray said. Cynthia looked at him. It's a formal recognition, Ray said. It means someone up the chain of command thought what he did was significant enough to write down and send up to the Admiralty. It's not the highest decoration, but it's not nothing. It means they thought he was worth remembering. She was quiet for a long time after that. He would have hated a fuss, she said finally. He would have said it was nothing. He was always saying things like that it was nothing, that other people had it harder, that he just happened to be standing in the right place. She paused. Or in the right water, I suppose. Ray told her about the man in the water. He told her what her father had written. He watched her face while he told it, and when he was done she pressed her hand flat on the table beside the letter, not touching it, just near it, as if she needed something solid to hold on to. He lived his whole life, she said, and he never told me. There's something you should understand about the men of that generation, if you don't already. Not all of them, because people are people, and some of them talked, and some of them wrote books, and some of them joined veterans associations, and marched every November with their chests full of medals. But some of them, and Petty Chester Aubrey was clearly among them, came home from wherever they'd been and put the thing in a box, not because they were ashamed of it and not because they'd forgotten it, but because talking about it felt like a kind of taking, like claiming credit for something that belonged to everyone who'd been there, including the ones who hadn't made it home. Chester Aubrey had come home to Kemptville in 1945. He had married Margaret Ewellett in 1947. He had worked for 32 years at the Agricultural Supply Cooperative outside of town, a quiet, practical man who fixed things when they broke and kept his grass cut and built a workshop in the shed behind the house where he spent his evenings. His daughter grew up in that house. His grandchildren played in that backyard. His medals were in a trunk in the basement. His mention in Despatches was in a canvas-wrapped bundle under a dress uniform no one knew he had. And the letter, the only time he ever explained himself, the only time he ever put the thing into words, was sitting in the bottom of that trunk, unaddressed, with no instructions about what was supposed to happen to it. Ray brought the trunk to Cynthia Berard the following week. He brought everything, the uniform, the case with the ribbons, the letter. He helped her carry it into the living room of the house she'd moved into after the estate sale, a smaller place on the edge of town, still full of boxes she hadn't finished unpacking. They set the trunk down in the middle of the living room floor. Cynthia's son was there, Marcus Berard, 17. The kind of teenager who carries himself with the specific self-consciousness of a boy who has recently gotten tall and isn't sure what to do with it yet. He'd come over to help his mother move some furniture. He was in the kitchen doorway when Ray and Cynthia came in with the trunk. "What's that?" Marcus said. "Your great-grandfather's," Cynthia said. She opened the lid. She lifted out the dress uniform, still wrapped in its canvas, and set it on the couch. She lifted out the case with the ribbons. She set it on the coffee table and opened it. Marcus came into the room. He stood looking at the ribbons in their case. He picked up the one at the end, the one with the small bronze oak leaf, the mention in Despatches, and turned it over in his hand. "What's this one for?" he said. Cynthia looked at Ray. Ray looked at the oak leaf in the boy's hand. "That one," Ray said, "is for going into the water." Marcus looked up. "The North Atlantic's," Ray said. 1943. Your great-grandfather went into the water to pull a man out. In winter, the water was maybe 2 degrees. He had a line on him, so he wasn't in it long, but long enough. The man he pulled out lived. Marcus turned the ribbon over in his hand again. He set it carefully back in the case. "He never said anything about it," Cynthia said. "Not once. Not in his whole life." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the case. "Why not?" he said. Cynthia didn't answer right away. Ray didn't either. "Because he thought it was enough to do it," Cynthia said finally. "I think that's why. He thought doing it was the thing, not talking about it." There was one more thing in the trunk. Ray had found it in the first pass and set it aside, uncertain what to make of it, and he had not mentioned it to Cynthia until now. It was a photograph. Black and white, wallet-sized, the kind that came in a strip from a photo booth. 2 men, young, early 20s at most, standing with their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the particular grin of men who are pretending to be less tired than they are. On the back, in pencil, in handwriting that was not Chester Aubrey's careful angular script, but something looser and more hurried. "Sackville, August 43. You and me, Chester, whenever you need reminding." There was a name signed below it, The name was Reginald Croft. Ray had looked up Reginald Croft. He had not found much. A name on the crew manifest of HMS Sackville. No further record, no obituary that matched. No living relatives that a morning's research could identify. He had found one thing, a casualty record in the Library and Archives Canada database listing an ordinary seaman Reginald Croft as lost at sea, November 1943, in the North Atlantic. 2 months after the photograph was taken, Ray showed the photograph to Cynthia. He told her what he'd found. She held the photograph for a long time, looking at the two young men with their arms around each other's shoulders. "So Dad went into the water," she said quietly, "and then 2 months later his friend." "Yes," Ray said. She put the photograph down on the coffee table beside the ribbon case. She didn't say anything for a while. Marcus was still standing in the doorway to the kitchen. He'd heard all of it. Was that why he didn't talk about it? Marcus said. Because of his friend? None of them could answer that. Chester Aubrey had not written about Reginald Croft in his letter. Maybe because he couldn't. Maybe because some things don't get folded into canvas and put in a trunk. Some things stay outside of any container you might try to put them in. But he had kept the photograph. He had kept it for 80 years, at the bottom of the trunk, in the dark, where no one would find it and no one could ask him about it. "You and me, Chester, whenever you need reminding." Cynthia Berard called the Canadian Naval Memorial Trust 2 weeks later. She'd done some research on her own by that point. She'd found out that HMCS Sackville was still afloat, the last surviving Flower-class corvette, restored and moored in Halifax, open to visitors in summer. She had called the trust and explained who her father was, and they had been, she told Ray afterward, genuinely moved. They put her in touch with a historian named Dr. Paulette Gagnon, who was working on a project documenting the personal histories of Canadian corvette crew members, specifically from the North Atlantic escort work. Dr. Gagnon was from Moncton, and she had the kind of patient, exact manner of someone who had spent a career listening to things that were hard to say. Cynthia sent her the letter. She sent her photographs of the uniform, the ribbons, the photograph of Chester and Reginald Croft. Dr. Gagnon called her a week later and said she wanted to talk. "He was mentioned in the action report," Dr. Gagnon told her. "The mention in Despatches was official, but there's also a line in the action report from the convoy commander. He described an unnamed rating who entered the water without hesitation to retrieve a merchant sailor from a stricken vessel. He said, and I'm quoting here, that the man's conduct reflected the finest traditions of the Royal Canadian Navy." Cynthia was quiet on the phone for a long moment. "He used to say he was just on a boat," she said. "A lot of them said that," Dr. Gagnon said. "That's why this project exists. Because they wouldn't say anything else." Ray Dufresne drove to Halifax in October, which is not the obvious month to drive to Halifax. The weather coming off the Northumberland Strait can be mean in October, and it was, but Cynthia had asked him to come, and he hadn't been able to think of a good reason not to. The ceremony was small, the way Chester Aubrey would have wanted it if he'd had any say in the matter, which he didn't because he was gone, and the living sometimes get to decide these things in the end. There were maybe 20 people in the small meeting room at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. Dr. Gagnon, a few members of the Naval Memorial Trust, a representative from Veterans Affairs Canada who had driven up from Dartmouth, and Cynthia and Marcus's younger sister, who was 12, and had spent the drive from Kemptville listening to her mother explain who Petty Chester Aubrey was and what he had done. The uniform was in a display case that the Memorial Trust had prepared. The ribbons were mounted properly in order, with the mention in Despatches at the end where it belonged. The photograph of Chester and Reginald Croft was there, blown up and framed. The two young men still grinning, still pretending they weren't tired. The representative from Veterans Affairs read the citation. He read it the way people read these things when they understand what they're doing. Slowly, with full stops at the end of every sentence, so that the words have somewhere to land. When he read the line about the finest traditions of the Royal Canadian Navy, Marcus Berard made a sound that was not quite a cough and not quite anything else, and his mother put her hand on his arm. Dr. Gagnon spoke for a few minutes about the Battle of the Atlantic and about the men who served on the corvettes. She said that the North Atlantic campaign was the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War. She said that Canada's contribution to it was larger, proportionally, than almost any other Allied nations. She said that the men who crewed the corvettes had done their work in some of the worst conditions imaginable, for years, often without recognition, and that many of them had come home and done exactly what Chester Aubrey had done. They had put the thing in a box and gotten on with being alive. "The trouble with that," she said, "is that when they're gone, the box goes too, unless someone opens it." She looked at Ray when she said that. Ray looked at the display case, at the uniform with its 4 ribbons, at the photograph of the 2 young men with their arms around each other on the deck of a corvette in the North Atlantic in August of 1943. He thought about the sign on the folding table. $20 for the whole lot. He thought about the word lot, which can mean many things: a parcel of land, a batch of auction items, a measure of fortune. A lot, the lot of a man's life, piled on folding tables in a driveway on a grey morning in September. He thought about Reginald Croft, who had signed a photograph, "You and me, Chester," and had been dead for 80 years and had no marker here, no ribbon in a case, no citation read aloud in a museum room. Maybe someday, maybe that was a different trunk, waiting in a different basement, in a different house on a different street, for someone to stop when they didn't have to stop. After the ceremony, they walked down to the waterfront. It was cold, the way Halifax is cold in October. A wind off the harbour that means business. The Sackville was moored a short distance away, her black hull and white superstructure distinct against the grey water, smaller than you'd expect for a ship that had crossed the North Atlantic in wartime, although maybe that's what makes it worse, not better, that they were that small out there. Marcus's sister, her name was Audrey, Cynthia had mentioned, though nobody had called her anything but the younger one all day, walked ahead of them along the waterfront, hands in her pockets, looking at the Sackville. She stopped when she was close enough to see the pennant numbers on the hull. She stood there for a while, looking at the ship. Then she turned around and walked back to where her mother and Ray were standing. "Did he ever come here?" she said, "to see it?" Cynthia shook her head. "I don't think so. He never mentioned it." Audrey turned back to look at the ship. "But he knew it was still here," she said. "I think so," Cynthia said. "He would have known." Audrey was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. That was all, just that one word, standing there on the waterfront in the October wind, looking at the ship her great-grandfather had served on and never talked about. Good. Ray Dufresne stood there with them and said nothing, because there was nothing to add. Chester Aubrey had gone into the water in the dark, in the cold, in the middle of the North Atlantic, and pulled a man out and come home, and kept it in a trunk for 8 decades, and died at 91 in June with the maples coming into leaf outside his window. And now his great-granddaughter was standing on the Halifax waterfront saying good, and the word landed the way the last word of a long story lands, simply with the weight of everything that came before it. The story was his to keep. He kept it. Now it belongs to all of us.